Coming in number 10, we have ARNE Cheyenne Johnson. Not everything that the Warrens were involved in had to do with them going into a house to try and kick some spiritual butt. I mean, this case started like that, but then it turned into one of the most famous court cases of all time. ARNE Cheyenne Johnson had the Warrens come to his home to help a young boy who was apparently possessed by a demon. The Warrens were successful in ripping the demons out of this boy's body, which there were apparently 40 of, but something went wrong. The demons left the boy's body, but then moved over to ARNE Cheyenne Johnson's body. Can we just address a couple of things here? First, how many demons can fit into one body? This dude had a house party living inside of him, and that turned him completely evil. But what if you just had like 1 or 2 demons inside of you? Could you just keep living as a normal person, but you would just feel dehydrated sometimes? Like, what's the deal on that? And you think the Warrens would be better at their job and know to not let the demons move from one body into another body. But back to my story of Mr. Johnson. These demons started to drive him crazy, and then one day he snapped and attacked his landlord. He stabbed him multiple times, which led to his death. Johnson was arrested, and during the trial he used the defense of being possessed, where the Warrens actually came in to speak on the matter, since they kinda were the reason that the demons were in his body. Now, even though these demons were floating around in him, apparently he was still sent to prison, which I think is the right thing to do. Next on the list, guys, we have the PERRON family. This is a very disturbing case that is one of the most famous that the Warrens investigated. If you have seen the movie The Conjuring, then you will have an idea of what went on here. This is the case the movie was based on. And to be fair, the real case is actually even scarier. This was when the PERRON family moved into a home back in 1971. They were probably happy to have a house that was such a steal, but all of that happiness would go away when they found out what was going on within the walls. Turns out the whole place was infested with ghosts. At first it seemed like nothing too big. There were small items that would go missing and dirt that would show up in rooms. Then things started to get more intense. Their beds would float and people started to see ghosts walk through the halls. The PERRON family started to look into what was going on in this home, and they found out that many people had died on the property. A lot of them had taken their own life, and there were even people who had hung themselves, or even creepier, some people had drowned themselves behind the house in a river. The Warrens came through and were able to perform an exorcism to clean up the house, and the PERRONs eventually stopped having ghostly troubles. Next on the list, guys, we have the White Lady of Union Cemetery. The Union Cemetery is one of the most famously haunted places in America. This has been a hotspot for ghosts since the 1700s. Now, the Warrens weren't the first to come in and investigate this place for being packed with ghosts, but they did some pretty intense experiments to try and confirm their beliefs that ghosts were haunting the area. Ed went in there and spent 7 nights in the cemetery. That's like one of those questions where someone's like, what would you do for $1 million? Would you spend 7 nights in a cemetery? But this dude was doing it just for poops and giggles. I'm not going anywhere near that thing unless I'm getting at least 10K. But Ed did get exactly what he was looking for. During one of his nights in the cemetery, he saw a figure of a woman who was crying and walking towards him, but shadow figures came out and stopped her from reaching Ed. He snapped a picture that looked like a big white blob, but he claims that this was the White Lady using her electromagnetic energy to grab his attention. Next on the list, we have the BORLEY church hauntings. The Warrens better be racking up a lot of money for all the movies that were made about their adventures. I hope that I live such a wild life that when I get old, people make movies about what I did. Now, if you have seen the movie The Nun, then you will know the backbone of this story. I don't think I need to state that the movies exaggerate what happened in real life, but this did take place at a church. There were reports of some creepy things happening. There was a headless ghost that would be seen walking around the church that people thought was a monk. There was the ghost of a dead nun that was seen walking around as well. Apparently, there was a body found of a nun in the walls of the church. It's thought that she could have been buried alive for having an affair with one of the monks. Damn, dude, they really didn't take stuff lightly back then. Next on the list, we have Bill Ramsey. Now, out of all the ones on this list, it would seem that this one would be probably the coolest. From the time Bill Ramsey was a kid, he had some pretty crazy things going on. He was insanely strong, and he would sometimes act like an animal. Maybe he was just a weird kid, and no one really cared because eventually he started acting normal. That's until he was a grown man. He started to crave blood and would wake up in the middle of the night panting like an animal. Eventually, he has to be locked up for the protection of the people around around him when he started to attack people, and it took 6 cops to take him down. The Warrens came in and performed an exorcism, and after that he was as right as rain. Next on this, guys, we have the SMURL family. It would seem that you couldn't move into a new home in the 70s or 80s without having something to do with ghosts inside of it already. Well, the Warrens were hot on the trail of this one after the SMURL family was attacked by several ghosts in their home. People were pushed down the stairs, the dog was thrown against the wall, items in the home were broken, and even things that were too graphic for this channel happened. The Warrens came in and pushed the ghosts out, and while doing so, they saw a dark being appear out of the floor and float up to the ceiling. Next on the list, guys, we have the ENFIELD poltergeist. Not every case with the Warrens turned into them being the masters of the spectral realm. Sometimes people wanted nothing to do with them. There was the case of the ENFIELD poltergeist, where there was apparently a kid who had a ghost living inside of him. Now, there were a bunch of reports saying that this kid was just making this up, but this didn't stop the Warrens from investigating. They heard word of a ghost and they wanted to get to the bottom of it. But when they showed up, they didn't even tell the family that they were coming. They thought they were famous enough to just be allowed to walk around any rumor of a ghost. I think the clout was getting to their head a little bit. But what ended up happening was the family didn't even let them into the house. The family talked to them for a little bit, but that's about as far as they got in terms of removing a ghost from a child. Next on the list, guys, we have the haunting in Connecticut. If I move into a new place, one of the first things I'm going to ask is if there has ever been a dead body in the house. It would seem that most ghost problems come from a slew of corpses hanging out in the basement at one time or another, and that's exactly what we have here. It was Carmen and Al Snydecker that needed to move into a new home so they could be closer to the hospital. See, their son was very sick and they wanted to be able to rush over at a moment's notice. Because of their desperation, they moved into a home that used to be a mortuary. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of ghost activity hanging around in the home. The family saw a ton of spectral activity. There was dead bodies that would rise out of the ground, blood would come out of the tap, spirits would walk down the hall. Now, there has been a ton of evidence to disprove a lot of the stuff the Warrens have said about the home, but I would like to add on the craziest thing that they said was causing the haunting. The Warrens claimed that the spirits who haunt the home were angry because the people who used to work in the morgue would have sex with the dead bodies. Yeah, I didn't know ghosts cared that much about what happened to their bodies after they died. And also, how do you get those kind of details from a ghost? It's additions like that that make you question whether or not the Warrens were actually telling the truth. Alright guys, next we have the ANNABELLE doll. This has to be one of the most famous cases the Warrens have ever investigated thanks to the ANNABELLE movies. Now, the movies spruced her up a little bit, having her looking like an old Victorian doll, but she was actually a Raggedy Ann doll, which makes her much less menacing. But the stories surrounding this haunting figure are still pretty terrifying. The ANNABELLE doll was owned by a nurse back in the 70s who thought that it was just a cute little thing until it started to wake her up in the middle of the night with the sounds of crying and dreams of her being strangled by the doll. Yeah, at this point she should have burned it. But the girl got in contact with the Warrens and found out that the doll was possessed by a demonic spirit. So what was the best course of action? Burn the doll, maybe? Nope, instead put in a glass case on display in the Warrens Museum. Don't worry, they made sure that the case was blessed by holy water. And next on the list, guys, we have the AMITYVILLE horror house. There has been movie after movie of this horror house, and even if you don't believe in ghosts, you have to admit that everything that went down in this house was pretty nuts. So the story starts with Ronald J. Defoe. This dude lived in the house with his family and then one day just snapped. He took a rifle and killed his whole family. That is insane and terrifying, but maybe the dude just went crazy and had nothing to do with ghosts. But then the Lutz family moved in and they said that a ton of horrific things happened while they were living in the house. They saw ghosts, they smelt rotting bodies, eyes would appear in rooms, their daughter would talk to an imaginary friend named Jody, and everyone in the family was constantly getting into fights. The family only lasted a month in the house before they fled because they were worried about ripping the family apart. After all this, the Warrens came in and they said that there was a demonic being in the house, and Lorraine saw bodies laid out on the floor through her psychic powers. And then they found out that back in the 1900s, someone used the house to practice black magic.
Number 10. We're starting off strong with the Devil Made Me Do It case. If you're a fan of Ed and Lorraine, you know this one. The Devil Made Me Do It case is arguably one of the most famous cases that Ed and Lorraine ever worked on. But beyond the supernatural, this case was right in the public eye. Not only were there demons and the supernatural, but the scrutiny of the public eye made this a whole different monster for the Warrens. A bunch of people outside of the courthouse making claims and threats over the case isn't easy to deal with. When 19-year-old ARNE Cheyenne Johnson took the life of his landlord and blamed it on the devil, Ed and Lorraine jumped to his defense. They were convinced a demon had entered him after he tried to save his brother from from a vicious possession a year earlier. His younger brother was possessed by 43 demons, and ARNE commanded that they leave him and enter him instead. The Warrens fell under immense scrutiny, but according to them, the court had defended accounts of God in the past. Now it was time to defend accounts of the devil. But one thing remains strange to me. ARNE was never exorcised after the event. Does that mean they are still with him? Number 9. Highgate Cemetery. Where were they for the vampire hysteria at Highgate Cemetery? Like, where were you? When I learned about this case, I was flabbergasted, and it's weird to me that they weren't there. They've dealt with werewolves but missed out on vampires completely? The Highgate Cemetery in London, England has some of the oldest graves in the world, making it the perfect breeding ground for ghosts, ghouls, goblins, and vampires. Ooh, it's spooky season. The Highgate vampire case caused a media uproar in the 60s that culminated in two magicians facing off to see who could catch the vampire first. It all started when two girls reported seeing the dead rise from the graves while walking through Swain Lane one night. Soon, animal carcasses drained of blood started turning up. Newspapers had their cameras ready. A massive vampire hunt was organized on Friday, April 13th, in 1973, and bodies were even exhumed from their graves to see if they were toothy. Sadly, no one caught anything, but the case still sends a tingle down the spines of vampire enthusiasts around the world. Legends of the demon, though, continue, along with sightings of a crazed old woman and corpses appearing in places they shouldn't be. Number 8. The Bell Witch. I searched the internet far and wide to see if the Warrens had ever visited the Bell Farm, but alas, no. If I'm wrong and I missed something, post a link down in the comments because I'm not perfect and maybe I missed it. But as far as I can see, they never actually checked out one of the most famous hauntings in the world. 200 years later, the Bell Cave remains an attraction, and many still report hearing a shrill, scratchy voice when no one is around and see orbs surrounding the farm, or where it used to stand. Though the actual events happened well before the time of the Warrens and the farm was torn down, the Bell Cave was still there. If there was any duo who could have proven the tale of the Bell Witch, it was them, but maybe, just maybe, they were afraid of what they might find. Number 7. Michael Taylor. The Michael Taylor case is one of the strangest I've ever come across while doing lists like this, and it certainly needed Ed and Lorraine. The horrifying events of Michael Taylor happened in the 1970s, specifically 1974. A man who was considered a good husband, father, and community man suddenly flipped. He began enduring bouts of severe depression and was visiting a 21-year-old pastor named Marie Robinson for counsel. His wife was obviously suspicious, but the sessions were helping. Mary allegedly performed many exorcisms on him to expel the demons. Taylor's wife was getting pretty antsy, and they ended up having a confrontation during which Taylor attacked his wife. It was after this moment Taylor resolved to undergo a full-blown exorcism on October 5th, 1974. During this, Michael had seizures, he spit and bit the ministers, and screamed in tongues. Unfortunately though, it did not expel all the demons, and Taylor returned home in a rage. He took the life of his wife in an incredibly gruesome way, and was later found screaming in the street, naked and covered in blood. I don't think the Warrens ever encountered anything as violent, but imagine if they did. Number 6. Richard Gallagher and Julia. Richard Gallagher is a man I find entirely fascinating because his transition from being a man of science to a full-on believer of the occult is, for lack of a better word, insane. Now obviously the Warrens had their domain, but imagine if these guys collaborated on this case? What? Though, I don't know if Gallagher needed the help, just saying. The case I'm referring to is when Gallagher encountered a transformative possession. Gallagher became the go-to guy to diagnose people who claimed to be possessed. An Ivy League psychiatrist, he would help those who were mistaking mental illness for something mystical. Julia was the first time he encountered someone he couldn't explain. Julia was the queen of a satanic cult and had become possessed, which she desperately wanted to be rid of. Skeptical at first, but when Richard sat down to talk to her, she knew intimate details about his life. Objects would fly off the wall, and once during a phone call with the priest, they both heard one of the demonic voices she'd speak in around them, even though Julia was across the country. Number 5. The Thornton Heath Poltergeist. It was the 1970s. Thornton Heath, England. Where were the Warrens? Probably busy, or too scared to bother with such a terrifying case. It all started one hot August evening when the family living in the house was awoken by their radio suddenly blaring to life. This was just the beginning to a terrible haunting the family would endure for 4 years. Objects would fall or be thrown across the room by invisible hands, you know, all the usual poltergeisty things. One night, the son awoke to find a man standing at the end of his bed, like staring at him with like venom in his eyes. After a bunch of startling incidents, they tried to have the house blessed, but it failed. However, a medium did discover that the house was haunted by a couple named the Chattertons who considered them trespassers on their property. The family eventually had no other option but to move out, and the activity has since ceased. But imagine if the Warrens were on the case, probably would have been solved so much sooner, or not, who knows. Number 4, the Danny poltergeist case. In 1998, a woman named Jane Fishman reported strange happenings regarding an antique bed in the home of Al Cobb in Savannah, Georgia. It was a vintage 1800s bed that Cobb bought at auction for his son, a purchase he later regretted. 3 nights after it was purchased, Jason, the son, told his parents that someone was watching him on the bed. He felt cold breath on his neck and saw the impressions of elbows dipping into the pillow. He also noticed the photo of his deceased grandparents lying face down on the dresser, which became a reoccurring event. After he put it back up, it'd fall back out. But then, one morning, an assortment of strange objects including animals made from shells was found on his bed after he'd already gone down to breakfast. That got his parents and his twin brother's attention. They left paper and crayons out and asked the ghost what his name was. Then later they came back to see Danny 7 written on the paper. After several communications and a smashed terracotta planter, it was clear that Danny didn't want anyone in his bed. The family eventually got rid of the bed, but that didn't solve the problem. Turns out Jason's connection to the spirits went skin deep, and he continued to see things after the event. Number 3, here we go. The Winchester house. This place is on my bucket list to visit, so it's a wonder to me why the Warrens never checked it out. Again, I googled it, they didn't. Prove me wrong in the comments. I welcome correction, as always, thank you. But it's essentially a 24,000 square feet mansion with 10,000 windows, 2,000 doors, 160 rooms, 52 skylights, 47 stairways and fireplaces, 17 chimneys, 13 bathrooms, 6 kitchens, and cost Sarah $5 million to build, about $71 million today. There are stairs and doors that lead to nowhere, windows that don't open. It's a labyrinth of mystery. Sarah Winchester and her husband William Winchester amassed a huge fortune from their sale of the, you guessed it, Winchester rifle. After her daughter died of TB and William left Sarah a widow, she consulted a medium who told her that she would constantly be haunted by the spirits killed by the Winchester rifle. The house never stopped construction until she died in 1922. It is said the house was built to trap the spirits inside. Today, it's considered one of the most haunted places in the world and is well worth a visit for anyone seeking a scare. So where the heck were the Warrens to debunk this thing? It would have been awesome. Number 2, the Amityville horror case. Obviously, I had to put this case on the list because this case remained the scariest event of Ed and Lorraine's career.
It had the monstrosities of the night which roamed that house, which infested it, which caused a young man to murder his whole family.
The events at Amityville, Long Island in 1975 shook the nation and the box office. The Lutz family moved into their dream suburban home with optimism and hope for their life. But little did they know, a year earlier, Ronald DeFia Jr. shot and killed all 6 members of his family, priming the property with evil. The Lutzes didn't know what to make of the swarms of flies, loud, aggressive banging noises, disturbing entities, and even levitations occurring in the home. So they got the hell out of Dodge, leaving all their belongings in the process. When they finally called the Warrens in, George Lutz, the father, who was, by the way, an ex-Marine and karate expert, literally supposed to be fearless, wouldn't even meet them at the house. They met at a Pizza Hut. But as soon as the Warrens began working on the case, they understood why.
The Amityville case affected our personal lives more than any case we ever worked on.
To this day, Lorraine says that this is the case that haunts her the most and said that she hoped this was the close to hell as she would ever get. So if that's not too scary, I don't know what is. And now we are getting to number 1, the Warrens. Demons, poltergeists, and ghosts. It was hard to find a case that the Warrens wouldn't face. They seemed fearless, their love strong enough to withstand all the forces of darkness, or at least that's how the movies told it. It turns out that the real case the Warrens were too afraid of was the horrifying truth of their marriage. Yup, we're going there. If you're a fan of the movie franchise, then you know that Lorraine had a lot of influence on the stories up until her death, but a weird detail in her contact alludes to some nefarious activity in their personal life. Neither Ed or Lorraine Warren could be depicted violating anyone or performing adult acts with a minor. The reason that was in there might have something to do with the case of Judith Penny. Penny stayed with the Warrens as a young woman and allegedly had an inappropriate relationship with Ed, and Lorraine knew about it. Judith made a legal declaration in November 2014 stating that Penny and Ed had begun an amorous relationship when he was her bus driver and she moved in with them in 1963. That same year, Penny was arrested when someone noticed the illegal relationship between her and Ed. Why she was arrested and not him remains in question to me, but Penny also stated that Ed was abusive towards Lorraine, saying, and I quote, "Sometimes Ed would actually have to slap her across the face to shut her up. Some nights I thought they were going to kill each other." Lorraine denied the allegations through representatives, and there are still a lot of loose ends, but I suppose whatever happened has already been taken to the grave. Number 10. The Devil Made Me Do It. In 1981, 19-year-old ARNE Cheyenne Johnson sparked controversy far and wide for a crime he wasn't behind, or so we think. While arguing with Alan Bono over Johnson's girlfriend, ARNE stabbed Bono, resulting in the man's death. When police arrived, ARNE claimed that the devil made him do it. When the words "the devil made me do it" came from his mouth, it sent the world into controversy. Apparently, ARNE was possessed by a demon that had not been vanquished by the Warrens at all. Ed and Lorraine had worked with his family a year prior when ARNE's girlfriend's brother David was possessed by not one, not two, but 43 demons. In order to save him, ARNE commanded the demons to enter him instead, so when his dark deed finally occurred, Ed and Lorraine flew to his defense. The Warrens stated that at the time of the exorcism, and I quote, "Johnson leapt up and cried to the demon, 'Come into me, I'll fight you, come into me.' But from that time on, he was possessed." The Paranormal Society was split in half, but Johnson's team was committed. The court had defended acts of God in the past, like a lightning strike to a tree hits a car, you know what I mean? And now it was time to defend accounts of the devil. But despite what you believe, it wasn't enough, and Johnson received a maximum sentence but was released after good behavior just 4 years later. But still, the fact that these demons were never truly vanquished left the Warrens terrified that this might be the case elsewhere. Number 9. The SMURL Haunting. Jack and Janet Smurl sound like they should be like the leading couple of a comedy featuring Jennifer Aniston and Jason Sudeikis. But of course, wrong list. The plight of the couple attracted the attention of Ed and Lorraine Warren after a series of dark and ominous events struck, of course. In the 1970s, the family started experiencing shocking technical mishaps like their TV bursting into flames and toilets flushing by themselves. I know, do ghosts poop? Apparently. At first, they didn't think anything of it, but then the knocking started, in a peculiar pattern of 3 followed by terrible sudden odors, making the Smurls feel ill. The strange noises and smells were swiftly followed by sightings and thus entered the Warrens. The Warrens discovered a presence of 3 separate demons, and despite 3 exorcisms, the family reported the return of the demons until finally they let go 15 years later. Number 8. The Haunting in Connecticut. The mortuary turned home for the Snedeker family in Southington, Connecticut definitely created the perfect breeding grounds for a scary story, one that left even the Warrens uneasy in their skin. First off, moving into a mortuary? No thank you. In the 1980s, the Warrens took on the case of Carmen and Al Snedeker, who were being tormented by a series of restless spirits and demons. So in this case, it's not just one, but many that they feared. The family reported the smell of rotted flesh lingering in the house because, I don't know, it was a mortuary, and that the taps would turn red out of nowhere. The eldest son was plagued by visions of ghosts, and both Carmen and Al reported being sodomized by the ghosts. It's a very specific activity. Which led to the Warrens making the discovery that whoever the morticians were, their activities were not always professional, if you get my drift. I don't know what's worse, the demons themselves or like the people who used to live there. Ugh, can't handle that. This was one of their most confusing cases and remains under scrutiny to this day, but the Warrens knew whatever it was had to be exorcised. But the question is, was it really, or is it just hiding out until someone else comes along? Number 7, the Enfield haunting. I don't know what it is with the 70s, man. It just seems like so much weird stuff happened. We had serial killers. It's nuts. But it just seems like it's one of the strangest times in history, what with violent killers and violent hauntings. The Enfield haunting took place in Brimstown, England, and remains one of the more boggling cases the Warrens worked on. Peggy Hodgson and her family claim to have seen furniture and toys being thrown and moved by unknown forces in their homes. They even claimed that violent voices were heard and that their children were levitating in the air. They caught the photo of the girls levitating when the investigators set up a wired control camera into the room, which periodically caught images throughout the night. Whatever it was, the Warrens knew there was a demonic entity within the house and immediately set to work. Number 6, the Perron family case. The Perron family lived in the old Arnold estate, which inspired the scariest film I have ever seen personally, because if you've watched me on Central Dark, you know how low my tolerance is. But anyway, it's still awful. Yeah, you know it, you've heard of it. 8 generations of families lived and died in the old house and apparently never wanted to leave, or never could. When the Perron family moved in the 1970s, the advice they got was to leave the lights on always. Why didn't you leave then? I don't know. I don't know how that didn't send them running for the hills. The house had been rife with tragedy, but one of the 3 people who took their own lives was an alleged Satanist whose activity was responsible for the possession of the house. Her name was Bathsheba Sherman, who became a demon that Lorraine will never forget. The demon would physically attack the daughters of the Perron family, with one reportedly seeing a floating head screaming and retching at her. Ugh, I almost didn't say her name, but I did, so we'll see what happens to me now. Number 5, the Shadow Doll. The Shadow Doll is literally the doll of your nightmares. The Shadow Doll comes from unknown origins but was kept in the Warrens Museum for safekeeping. But what we do know was that it was used for satanic rituals, and that the thing is doused in black magic and contains human and animal bones. Whatever possesses this thing had the Warrens take it into their possession to ensure that it caused harm to no one else. Legend has it that if you take a picture of the doll, it will possess your nightmares. But it won't just be any nightmare. It will be the most terrifying you've ever experienced, and some have even suffered heart attacks from them. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't they just burn the thing? Well, what's more dangerous? A demon you can see right in front of you, or one free to wander wherever it chooses? Honestly, I take the spider approach with this. If you see the spider, you know where the spider is, you're good. As soon as the spider disappears, burn your house down. Number 4, Valak. This one is a little controversial because was it just made up for the films? We don't know. Valak is a real demon mentioned in the Lesser Key of Solomon that was introduced into the Conjuring series of films. Though her direct involvement with Lorraine and Ed is under debate, Lorraine's belief in the demon was very strong. Valak is referred to as the Great President of Hell, and usually chooses to appear as a small winged, 2-headed creature thing resembling a child. Valak is said to command 30 legions of demons, and in the film became the leading arch nemesis of the Warrens. We'll mention BORLEY Church in a second, but Valak was portrayed as a nun. But there is some speculation that says that they may have actually encountered him throughout some of their worst cases. Lorraine often said that she encountered a black, shadowy vision of a dark entity whenever she wasn't working on a case, and believed that she was being followed by something she couldn't explain. Want to know more? Stay tuned until the end of the video and make sure to like and subscribe while we're here. Number 3, BORLEY Church relates to Valak. We'll talk about this in a second. The grim history of BORLEY Church is the perfect setting for a horror film. The land upon which it is built used to be the home to a 14th century monastery, where a monk fell in love with a nun at a nearby convent, which led to the monk being hanged, and the nun was bricked up alive within the walls of her convent, which sounds pretty friggin' extreme if you ask me. It sounds like evil resided there long before Ed and Lorraine made the trek out to sort out whatever demon lay between its walls. Whoever did that to those 2 poor people, ugh, that's awful. This case inspired the famous nun apparition, as I mentioned, as the youngest daughter of the family who settled there reported seeing her figure. She was also pushed and slapped hard enough to leave welts behind, and that was just in the 1800s. When Ed and Lorraine visited, they obtained photo evidence of the hauntings. Ed Ed captured the image of a monk leafing through one of the books at the altar, and Lorraine experienced a black entity rush past her phallic. She remembered feeling an overwhelming sense of evil. A picture revealed later showed that the shadow of a nun was rushing past her, so that's where the image came from. So was it phallic? We don't know. Number 2, the Annabelle doll. You knew. Probably the most famous of the hauntings conquered by the Warrens was the Annabelle doll. It would almost be a crime not to mention it. Dolls are already eerie with their like black, piercing, beady eyes that look like there's nothing there. But in this case, the most terrifying part was the thing behind it. The case dates back to the 1970s when a Raggedy Ann doll was innocently purchased from an antique store for her daughter. Soon the doll began raising alarm when it would change positions in the house, boggling its owners. But when the notes started showing up saying help me and help Lou, then they came home to find it covered in blood, and they decided then that they needed to call a professional. The first medium they called in said it was just the spirit of a girl who passed away, but then the owner, Angie's boyfriend, was attacked. Enter the Warrens. They knew the doll was in fact a demon based on the marks of the beast and other encounters. They removed the doll and took it home, vowing not to take the highway, concerned that whatever was within the doll might cause an accident. Indeed, their brakes stalled or failed several times on their way home, putting their life in jeopardy several times. It wasn't until Ed doused the doll in holy water that the problem desisted. The couple was so concerned about the doll that Ed routinely said a prayer over the doll every single night. Alright, number 1, the Amityville horror case. The setting: Amityville, Long Island in 1975. A place rife with satanic manifestations set on driving whoever entered to violent madness. As soon as I even say Amityville, you know where this is going. One of the most famous Warren cases, this haunting continues to land on the conclusion that there are just some things that can't be explained. A year before the Lutzes moved into the suburban home in Long Island, Ronald DeFay Jr. shot and killed the 6 members of his family. So it's no wonder that during the first month of living there, the Lutzes experienced swarms of flies, loud banging noises, disturbing entities, and even levitations. The Lutzes moved out and left all their belongings behind, and George Lutz, the father, an ex-Marine and karate expert, so clearly a tough guy, wouldn't even meet the Warrens at the house. He met them at a Pizza Hut. He was that scared. The Warrens said that this case affected their personal relationship to each other the most out of any case they've worked on. This entity followed the Warrens home the very first day, and Lorraine described being incredibly fearful. There was something she just couldn't explain. To this day, Lorraine says that this is the case that haunts her the most, and said, and I quote, she hoped that this was as close to hell as she would ever get. Number 10, the Keg Mansion in Toronto. This one's for me. I'm so sorry. But here it is. Tell anyone in Toronto that you're going to the Keg Mansion for dinner. Be ready to receive the... You know it's haunted, right? Because they will do that. They will do that. Because it is. I have been there on several occasions, and I can verify that heading to the upstairs girls' bathroom alone is a harrowing journey. The haunting goes back all the way to 1915. Before it was the Keg, it was the home of industrialist Hart Massey and his family. Legend has it that the Massey's daughter Lillian passed away, and her maid was so distraught over her death that she took her own life. That's one theory. Others say that she committed the act to avoid the dread of her affair with Massey being revealed. Either way, the ghostly image of a maid hanging by the neck has been seen multiple times by employees, I have friends who work there, and guests alike. It's been a keg since the 1970s, and Ed and Lorraine never visited, neither for business or pleasure. There are either 2 reasons for this: they were too busy, or the idea of a ghostly apparition appearing mid-bite didn't sound very appealing to them. How do you like your spirit? Rare or well done? Number 9, the Myrtles plantation. This 18th century plantation, along with a 600-acre land, carries with it a dark past. Perhaps it's due to the fact that no one was living in it as to why the Warrens never visited, but the haunting itself is pretty terrifying. Though only 1 person was confirmed to have been killed on the property, with the history of slavery surrounding the estate, the number is estimated to be a lot higher, as we can probably guess. One of the most famous ghosts who reportedly walks the ground is that of Chloe. Chloe was a slave who poisoned the birthday cake of the daughters of Clark Woodruff to take a small kind of revenge on her awful masters. She apparently didn't intend for the girls to die, only to fall ill, but alas, they died. When they did, her fellow slaves were so fearful of Woodruff finding out that they hung Chloe for her crimes. This tale has fluctuated over the years, but the verified murder was that of William Drew Winter, who was shot on his porch and reportedly crawled back into the house, climbed to the 17th step on the stairs in time to die in the arms of his love. Both tales have sparked sightings of spirits on the ground, and in Winter's case, visitors reportedly see and hear bloody footprints crawl to the 17th step and then stop. Had the Warrens visited the property, they could have potentially confirmed what spirits remain restless on the property, but alas, we will never know. Number 8. VILLISCA Axe House. Adding to this list of properties that make you want to run away is the VILLISCA Axe House. The story goes as follows. On June 10, 1912, Josiah and Sarah Moore, along with their children, were bludgeoned to death inside their home, but no one knows who did it. It is one of America's most infamous cold cases, and the home remains preserved exactly as it was, except for the bodies, obviously, though many report that their spirits remain. The Warrens never charged for their work. They simply liked helping people because go Warrens. But the people who now run the Haunted Museum have no problem charging their visitors. The house remains a tourist attraction and there's a steep price to pay should you wish to stay the night. Besides the $400 fee, it may cost you your life. Allegedly in 2014, a paranormal reporter stayed at the house, and at 12:45 in the morning, the owners got the call. The man was found covered in stab wounds, which authorities later reported were self-inflicted. The Warrens risked their well-being all the time. So my theory is that the investors were the ones that kept them away because they didn't want to scare the ghosts away because they were making them so much money, but you know, it would have been nice to hear their thoughts. Number 7. Los Feliz Mansion. Have you ever entered a room or building that immediately gave you like the heebie-jeebies, like something in your gut was screaming at you that you weren't supposed to be there? Well, that is the exact feeling people encounter when they stand outside this mansion. On the night of December 6, 1959, Dr. Harold Perelson snapped and took the life of his wife and eldest daughter before he took his own. His two youngest managed to escape after their eldest sister screamed. He was a successful doctor with a happy family life, so no one knew why this happened. Some blame financial issues after one of his investments failed, but one creepy factor was that a passage from Dante's Divine Comedy was left open on his bedside table like a note. Ever since the event, people report an overwhelming feeling of foreboding that prevents visitors from entering. It was used as a storage unit by a family who purchased it 2 years after the event, but it was never lived in again. Number 6. The Jean Harlow Haunting. It sounds like bad luck followed all those who lived in this home. You may have heard of old Hollywood actress Jean Harlow and her horrendously abusive husband, Paul Byrne. In 1932, Byrne took his own life while standing in front of a mirror, though some believe foul play since the butler who found him called MGM Studios first, not the police. Byrne's ex-girlfriend jumped off a boat to her death days later, so there was some speculation if it was her. Jean moved out, but died later at the ripe age of 26, super young. So as you can tell, that house did not have good vibes. But then, in 1963, Jay Sebring bought the house with his then girlfriend, Sharon Tate. Tate in a couple interviews recounted events in the house that creeped her out, such as the appearance of a short man, probably Byrne, staring at her in the master bedroom. She also saw a shadowy figure hanging with a slit throat in the hallway. Creepier still, Tate and Sebring would later fall victim to the horrendous and horrific Charles Manson massacres. Tate was the same age as Harlow when she died, also a really creepy coincidence. Something dark clung to whoever lived in the house and is still presumed to be haunted to this day. Number 5. 455 Sackett Street. When you think of a haunted house, a specific image appears in your brain. It's either a farmhouse or a mansion, there's really no in between. But you would think we would hear more about haunted apartment buildings since there is a large turnover, which is perhaps why the haunting of 455 Sackett Street didn't get as much attention. This place was riddled with unexplained fires, ominous feelings and sudden drops in temperature, and family tragedies. Everyone who lived there experienced dark things. What with the history of the building being riddled with insidious affairs, mob hits and dealings, and grim attacks, bound to happen. Jane, one of the women who lived there, once had a friend see a little boy in burnt rags staring at her. This event proved even more terrifying as after the woman moved out, the apartment was renovated. Within the walls of her apartment, they found a corpse fitting the above description, tucked inside the walls. So if you are ever in Brooklyn, don't request an in-person viewing. The Warrens never did. Number 4. Hotel Monte Vista. We all know the idea of a place being haunted is enough to lure in guests, but if guests can't even make it through the night, then there's a problem. And they needed the Warrens, but they never showed up. The Hotel Monte Vista opened as a community hotel in 1927, and soon a history of opium dens, tragic affairs, mob dealings once again, and secret gambling swelled around the place, as did their paranormal reputation. The hotel has become known for its ghostly sightings, such as in room 220. A long-term boarder had a strange habit of hanging meat from the ceiling in that room. I don't know why the hotel let them do that. And the lodger himself was found dead 3 days after his death. The TV allegedly changes channels on its own, and the sheets have been found torn to shreds. In room 210, the small voice of a bellboy announcing room service can be heard, though no one appears. John Wayne even experienced this. In room 306, the corpses of 2 women of the night were thrown over the balcony. Guests who stay there report feelings of being suffocated by hands while they sleep. Staff are plagued by sounds of infants crying in the basement and have been seen running to escape the sound. The list goes on and on. Perhaps it was more the money machine that kept the Warrens away, but it would have been cool to hear their take on the hauntings. Number 3. POVEGLIA Island. There are many reasons why the Warrens never visited this island, the number one being that it's so freaking terrifying it's actually illegal to visit. It's also in Italy, though they traveled all the time, so what's the reason? POVEGLIA Island place hosts over 160,000 violent deaths, from being a hospice for victims during the bubonic plague, then an asylum run by a mad doctor. The tormented past of the island has no limits. The story of the doctor on the island is the most menacing though. He performed cruel and malicious experiments on his patients, but their souls took revenge on him and allegedly drove him mad. So mad that he tried to throw himself off of the clock tower. And witnesses say that on the night it happened, a mysterious mist consumed the island. Those who decide to take a boat and venture as close as possible to it report hearing screams and moans that chill the bones. Even creepier, people report hearing a bell toll from across the bay, even though it was removed years before. Scientists who have studied the strange happenings of POVEGLIA have identified an electromagnetic field that surrounds the property, but there's no electricity to the island, so what's the reason? Number 2. The Dandy House. This may have been a job too big for the dynamic duo. A dream home turned nightmare, the Dandys experienced some of the most terrifying encounters since the Bell Witch. I said it. Clara and Phil Dandy lived in this house along with their kids in the 1970s and endured all kinds of encounters, from disembodied voices to footsteps racing around the house. It's a wonder they stayed as long as they did. The creepiest thing I saw described is that once they witnessed strange faces watching them through the windows. When Mr. Dandy ran outside to confront them, first of all, brave dude, badass, mad respect, the faces were looking out at him from inside the house. From there things got worse. Some of the things even sounded like aliens. They saw floating white specters and half animal, half human creatures watching them. Objects flew around the room, one lamp barely missed one of their daughters. They involved clergy and Ed and Lorraine to help clear the house, but even they couldn't rid the house of whatever possessed it. In fact, whatever they did made it worse. It got so bad, the Dandys ended up leaving the house after nothing worked. And last but not least, the Mothman in number 1. The legend of the Mothman, alien, angel, or demon. Described as a tall half-man, half-bird-like creature with glowing eyes, the Mothman even has skeptics unsure of what to say. The most famous groupings of sightings occurred between November 15th, 1966 to December 15th in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Prophetic in nature, sightings of the creature are often followed by tragic events such as the Silver Bridge disaster. The aforementioned bridge collapsed on December 15th, which coincided with the last sighting of the creature. 46 people passed away, and because sightings ceased after this, people believe he was an angel of death of sorts. More recently, sightings of the Mothman started taking place in 2011 in Chicago. I know the Warrens strictly dealt with demons and possession, but considering how mystifying this whole event was, it would have been interesting to hear what they had to say.